Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary bedrooms of medieval royalty, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim in the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year of our Lord 1274, the church bell rang, not to call the faithful, but to hide a transaction. In a forgotten village tucked between gray hills and colder nights, a young woman sat by the candlelight waiting for the man who said he was chosen by God. This is not a tale of saints, nor of sinners. It is a story of silence, bought with scripture, and the breath of a girl sold to salvation. Tonight we speak of the priest who said it was God's will, and so she obeyed. Sleep with me, and let the dark truth whisper itself into your dreams.
They say I was born during the hour of wolves, when the stable stank of afterbirth and frost, and no one had hands warm enough to care. My mother was a laundress nameless in the records, just one more pair of calloused hands scrubbing noble silk. She died before I could remember her face bled out into hay alone but for the moans of a foaling mare whose cries almost drowned hers. The midwife came, but only for the horse. They pulled me from between my mother's legs and wrapped me in a stained apron. No priest came to bless me. No name was whispered in awe. I was simply another mouth for the kitchens, another girl to sweep stone floors or empty chamber pots. Someone said I had good lungs. Another said I had strong legs. They all agreed that if I lived, I'd be useful. The first 10 years passed in the shadow of stone walls and meat smoke. I grew up in the servants' wing of Baron Darquis' estate. Scrubbing, boiling, fetching, never really noticed until I began to change. Breasts too soon, hips too early. I didn't know what they meant, but the maids did. You'll be sent upstairs soon, they said, eyes full of pity, or was it relief, one less girl for the steward to leer at? By 13 I understood. Not through a lesson, not from a warning, but from the silence of other girls who came back down the stairs with dresses torn and eyes like wet ashes. No one talked, no one named names. It was safer that way, because sometimes the ones who hurt you were the ones who paid for your food. They sent me to serve wine in the feast hall the winter I turned 14. I still remember the sound the goblet made when my hand trembled a chime, delicate and wrong. The Lord's cousin laughed. His fingers jeweled and pale stroked my wrist as he took the cup. I did not meet his eyes. I was learning. That night he summoned me. To help with the fire, the steward said. I had never lit a fire in a bedchamber before. I didn't that night either. The next morning I was bleeding, quietly, in linen no one would see. The cook's wife gave me herbs bitter on the tongue and said nothing, just slipped me a rag and muttered, "Don't let them see the blood. They don't like it when it looks like pain." Pain wasn't forbidden, only the sight of it. After that there were others. Sometimes there were coins on the table, sometimes not. Always the same. Don't cry, don't speak, don't bleed where anyone can see. I stopped using my name. It wasn't safe. They preferred silence over softness, obedience over identity. I began counting not the men, but the moments when I no longer felt like a person, just a mouth, a shape, a vessel that wasn't allowed to say no. And yet, I remember one day, one strange moment, a merchant from the coast, older sun-browned, asked me my name, nothing more, no groping hands, no orders, just, "What's your name, girl?" I froze. It was the first time in years anyone had asked as if it mattered. That night I crept into the steward's office and tore a scrap of parchment from the back of an inventory ledger. I wrote my name on it in charcoal, Aveline. It looked foreign, beautiful, like something only free girls were allowed to have. I hid it under my mattress like a secret prayer.
Years passed, more touches, more silence, but the parchment remained. And in the darkest nights, when someone took without asking, when my body was a transaction, I would touch it and remember I was born with a name. I was not born to be used.
But back then I didn't yet know how to escape. I didn't even know what escape looked like. I only knew how to kneel and to nod, how to survive without asking for more. Because I was a girl born for others, and no one ever asked if I wanted to be. The chamber had no name, not in the ledgers, not in the mouths of the staff. Even the steward who oversaw every bolt of linen and grain of salt in the estate never spoke of it. It was simply referred to with a nod, a gesture, a look that said, "You know where." I was 15 the first time I was sent there, my back still aching from scrubbing soot from the banquet hearth. I didn't know then what it meant, not really. The maid who handed me the robe just said, "Don't look at anything, and don't ask questions." The robe was velvet, pale blue with silver thread that scratched the skin. I'd never worn anything so fine. It made my arms look delicate, my skin brighter than it was. I remember thinking it looked like something a noble woman would wear to a feast. But the chamber wasn't a feast hall. It was a private room behind the library, hidden by a sliding wall of books. There were no windows, no icons of saints, just a bed of carved wood, clean sheets, wine, and silence. And on that bed sat the Baron. He wasn't cruel, not in the way of fists or fire. He was worse, polite, cold. He touched me like one tests the softness of a pillow, curious, not passionate, measured, not human. He told me I was a gift and that I should feel honored. I was to be seen, not heard, smiled at, not spoken to. He used words like favor and service to describe what he did, but I knew, everyone knew. That chamber was built for the same reason horse are bred or falcons are trained, to satisfy power's boredom. He didn't kiss me. He didn't ask if I wanted anything. He didn't even look into my eyes. He drank wine, unlaced his boots, then unwrapped me like I was already his because I was. Afterward, he handed me a coin. It was silver, shiny, useless. That coin meant I was paid. And if I was paid, it meant it wasn't a crime. In the days that followed, the cook stopped speaking to me. The other maids avoided my eyes. Only the old groundskeeper dared say anything, and all he said was, "You've been upstairs now." That's how they said it. Been upstairs, not raped, not used, not humiliated, just upstairs as if it were a floor you chose. But I didn't choose. I never did. I didn't even know there was a door until they opened it for me. The worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the emptiness. It was the feeling of being erased in plain sight. Like I had stepped into a role written long before I was born, and no one cared that I didn't know the lines. And that chamber, it was never cleaned by servants. It cleaned itself apparently, like magic. No one acknowledged the stains, no one replaced the sheets, and yet it was always ready. Ready for the next girl, because it was never just me. One night I lingered outside the chamber after I'd been dismissed. I waited until I heard another set of footsteps. Another girl. Younger maybe. I couldn't see her face, just her shadow. She paused before entering, her fingers tightening on the robe she'd been given. I wanted to speak, to warn her, but what could I say? That it would never end. That she'd stop being a person and start being a rumor. Instead, I left something on the floor, my silver coin. When she stepped inside the door, swallowed her, quietly, completely. Later that night, I returned to my room and tore a new scrap of parchment. I wrote just one sentence. The chamber exists. I folded it, pressed it under a loose stone in the floor. That was the beginning of the ledger. I began writing. Every time a girl disappeared for an hour. Every time a robe went missing. Every time the chamber door clicked shut behind someone too young to know what silence meant. And I never used names. Because in that house, names didn't protect us. Only secrets did. And I was learning how to keep mine sharp. They said it was for my soul. That I had been touched by filth, by sin, by the hands of men who saw me as flesh without breath, and now I must be made pure again. The chapel smelled of mold and old incense. The air was thick with prayers that had long since rotted. They dressed me in white linen, plain and clean, as if that could scrub memory from skin. As if a garment could unwrite what had already been written into my bones. The priest's name was Father Bellarmine, tall, soft-spoken, with eyes that never blinked fast enough. He held the Bible like it was a weapon and whispered Latin like a lullaby. But when he looked at me, it wasn't holiness that glinted behind his gaze. He told me I would be washed in the light of God. That I had been led astray by carnality, that I had tainted the virtue given at birth, and must be cleansed by the cloth of the righteous. I was made to kneel, not before a cross, but before him. He called it absolution, but I call it possession. His fingers trembled as they grazed my hair. His breath, sour with sacramental wine, hovered above my ear as he recited psalms and psalms and psalms until the verses blurred into moans and the word amen sounded like mine. There was no audience, no witnesses, only the stone saints looking down their mouths carved open in silent horror. Or silence, mistaken for consent like ours so often is. He undid the lace of my gown with the same reverence he used to lift the veil from the altar. And when I flinched, he said, "The Lord sees your shame. Let him strip it away." I wanted to scream, but every scream I'd ever loosed had returned to me empty. So I did not scream. I recited my own litany, my own cursed prayer. Under my breath, I whispered the names of every girl I knew who had gone missing after confession. Every girl sent for penance. Every girl who returned with her eyes dimmer and her soul sealed shut. I turned his holy words inside out, bent them backwards like twisted scripture. And when he whispered, "Let this sin be washed away," I whispered, "Let this rot be remembered." Because that night something in me stopped begging, and something else began watching. When he was done, when the linen clung to me like wet remorse, he handed me a rosary, a gift, he said, to remind me of redemption. I wrapped it around my hand until it cut the skin. That was the last time I knelt in a church, but it wasn't the last time I entered one. From that day forward, I began rewriting scripture in the margins of my mind. Where others saw angels, I saw liars. Where others saw mercy, I saw masks. Where others kissed the cross, I watched who was holding it. I didn't hate God, but I learned that men had carved his name into a tool they could brand us with. And if God truly saw all, then surely he saw through curtains, through robes, through vestments soaked in unspoken violations. And if he stayed silent, then so would I, until it served me not to be. I said no, that was all. No, I would not share the Count's bed. No, I would not sip from his goblet. No, I would not wear the red silk he offered, like a leash disguised as luxury. And for that just one quiet no, he called me a witch. It started with a whisper in the feast hall, tucked behind the clatter of goblets and the laughter of men too old to remember when consent became a conversation. She walks alone at night, they said. She speaks in tongues, they added. She doesn't bleed when the moon is full. All lies, but none that needed truth. In a world where a woman's value was measured by her willingness to be taken, refusal was a magic too dark to be understood. They dragged me from my chambers at dawn, barefoot on the frozen stones, my shift half torn, and eyes swollen not from guilt, but from disbelief. The guards did not look me in the eye. Perhaps they feared it'd curse them. Perhaps they knew the real curse was theirs to carry. In the dungeon they stripped me of everything but breath. The jailer, a man with hands like meat hooks, spat the word "sorcire" like it burned his lips, which he repeated in Latin and French in the language of fear. I did not cry. I counted every stone in the cell, every echo in the hallway, every rat that passed me like a priest avoiding confession. When the Inquisitor arrived, I knew his name before he spoke it. It was whispered by every girl who'd ever come back from trial, with a body that told a different story than her tongue.
Sir Ingraheim, cloaked in black with eyes like rusted blades. He called me child, then sinner, then whore, then demon. He asked if I had lain with the devil. I told him I had only ever lain with hunger.
He did not laugh, but his hands moved to his belt. Confess, he growled. To what? To being unowned, to being unwanted by a man whose belly folded over his greed. The first blow was not with a fist, but with words. You turned the Count down. That is not just defiance. That is heresy. They chained me to the stone post, the same post where women before me had left behind pieces of themselves, flesh, voice, belief. He pressed across to my skin and asked if it burned. No, I said. That earned me a slap, then two, then silence. But in silence I discovered something new. Power. Not theirs, mine. Because what they feared wasn't magic, wasn't the devil, wasn't some curse passed from womb to womb. What they feared was a woman who remembered every face behind the mask of piety, every voice that turned prayers into commands, every hand that reached for her like she was air owed to lungs they didn't earn. They locked me up to make me small, but the cell became a cauldron, and Ian Byrne began to boil. I carved names into the wall with a bone I hid from the stew. I memorized footsteps. I practiced my smile in the dark. By week's end, they brought me a nun to plead for my soul. She was barely older than me, eyes downcast, lips trembling as she spoke of repentance. I asked her how many witches she'd seen. She said too many. I asked her how many were guilty. She didn't answer, but her fingers grazed mine as she passed the bread, and in her palm was a scrap of cloth embroidered with the symbol of the moon. A sister in hiding. Not all women here came to pray. Some came to survive, and some like me came to remember. So I waited, and while they called me witch, I began to feel like one. Not because of spells or charms, but because I now knew the oldest form of magic was fear. And the smallest woman in the dirtiest cell could still make a count shiver in his silks if she just refused to kneel. In the cell across from mine, a woman died with her lips closed. Her name was Eleonora. She had red hair wild like firewood and eyes that looked too tired to burn. They said she bit a priest, that she spat in a nobleman's wine, that she called her own body a temple and barred the doors. I never saw her scream, not once. Instead, she sat like a ghost, might leaning against the wall, knees folded like prayer, whispering only to herself. They stopped feeding her on the 6th day. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't barter. By the 8th, her fingers shook. By the 10th, her voice was gone. By the 12th, so was she. No one claimed her body. No one lit a candle, but I did. In my own way, I etched her name into the wall with the sharp edge of a spoon handle, and beside it, I carved mine. Not out of grief, but out of warning. Because in this place, no was a death sentence, unless you learned how to whisper it with a smile. They say men are wolves, but wolves at least don't pretend to be saints. The guards came on the 13th day. One younger than the rest, cheeks still soft like he had kissed his mother that morning. He looked at me the way starving dogs look at meat, not out of hunger, but because no one had ever told them what else they were allowed to want. He brought extra bread, a bit of jam. He said his name was Jules. I knew what the kindness was for. They always came bearing mercy before they asked for obedience. So I asked nothing. I took the bread, thanked him sweetly, and met his eyes without flinching. That was new for him. He was used to women who begged or women who recoiled. He didn't know what to do with one who watched. The next day he stayed longer. By the 3rd visit he talked. I learned about his older brother, a blacksmith, about the girl he once loved who married a merchant instead. I learned he hated the dungeons, that he wanted to be a builder, not a guard, that his hands weren't meant for shackles. I smiled when he spoke, laughed when it helped, and every word he gave me became a thread in a net I was weaving, because Eleonora had died for saying no too loudly. I would survive by saying yes, just quietly enough to hear the echo of what I really meant. One night Jules brought me a cloak, said it belonged to his mother, said I should stay warm. He stood too close when he handed it to me. His hand brushed my cheek, and I let him, not because I wanted to, but because he needed to think I might. Consent wasn't a door you opened here. It was a blade you held behind your back, smiling, waiting for the right moment. I let him believe he had softened me. And when he brought me the key just to show me how easily he could unlock my cell, I kissed his wrist. Just once. Soft, grateful, terrified. He blushed like a child. He never noticed I had palmed the spare key he left on the tray. That night I didn't run. I wasn't stupid. Instead, I began a quiet trade. Information for favors, smiles for space, glances for silence. Each man who thought he owned me became another weight in my scale. Each lie I fed them became a truth they'd never see coming. I wasn't free, not yet, but I was no longer starving, and I was no longer alone. There were others women who had survived the dungeons longer than I'd thought possible. Some cleaned floors, some stitched clothes, some carried food. All had seen what happened to women who said no like they meant it. We spoke in nods, in brief touches, in glances that lingered too long to be innocent. And slowly the cracks in the walls grew wide enough to whisper through. I never stopped saying no. I just stopped saying it out loud. Because the truth is, in this world, a woman's refusal doesn't echo. It doesn't resonate. It is buried. So I became a gravedigger. And with every secret I planted in the dirt, a seed of vengeance took root. She came with the morning bread hands, trembling just enough to seem old, but her eyes were too sharp to match, gray like stone after rain. And when they landed on me, I flinched. She noticed, didn't speak, just left the tray and turned away. But the next morning she came again. This time she placed a cloth-wrapped bundle beside the bread, clean bandages, herbs wrapped in paper, and a small polished mirror with the silver nearly gone. She didn't ask about the bruises, didn't scold me for bleeding, didn't pray. Instead, she said one thing before she left. You hold yourself like you're about to bite someone. That's good. Don't stop. Her name was Thurs. They called her Sister Thurs out of habit, I suppose. Though I doubted the god she served had a name anymore. I learned she hadn't always worn a veil. Shed once belonged to a lord, the kind who liked his women educated but silent, graceful but pliant. She had been taught to recite poetry with her mouth full of blood, to embroider scripture into linens while nursing broken ribs, to play music during dinner while her own hands shook from what had been done to her hours before. And yet, when I asked her how she escaped, she only smiled and said I made myself useful in ways no man expected. It wasn't bitterness in her voice. It was amusement, a private joke no one else would dare laugh at. She became my shadow. She taught me how to lace herbs into tea that would lull a man into sleep, how to cry without tears just enough to rattle a soft-hearted guard, how to fold myself small, speak little, and watch everything. Power, she said one day, isn't just taken. Sometimes it's gifted by fools who think you are too broken to use it. That day she rubbed oil into the burns on my wrists, her hands so steady I forgot the pain. For a moment I leaned into her touch like a child would, and she let me, but she never coddled, never let me sink into self-pity. She reminded me often that sympathy had no place in war, and women like us were born into one long before we ever saw a battlefield. I once asked her why she stayed, why, after all she endured, she chose to remain within stone walls that reeked of men's shame. She looked at me long and quiet before answering. Because here I can train girls like you, and because here I am invisible. Men don't look too closely at women who serve. They don't see what we carry in our sleeves. She meant it literally. I found out she kept powdered hemlock in the cuff of her robe, enough to kill a grown man in 3 gulps. Never use it in anger, she warned. Use it when the silence needs to be permanent. It wasn't just poison she gave me, it was patience. She gave me language how to make a man believe he had won while quietly leading him to his own undoing. She called it weaponized weakness. And the first time I used it, I didn't feel guilt. I felt still. It was with a steward who asked too many favors. He liked to lean in close and tell me how pretty my mouth was when I said nothing. So one night I laughed a little when he touched my chin. I made my shoulders slump like I had given in. And when he relaxed, when his hands slid just low enough, I pinched a sliver of powder from my sleeve into his wine. He never woke up. They said his heart gave out, and I cried in front of the others. Thurs watched me from across the room, hands folded, veil down. We didn't need words. After that, she began to teach me in earnest how to read men's patterns, how to map their desires like roads, how to use softness as camouflage. She told me real love was a rebellion women like us rarely had the luxury to afford, but that kindness, chosen not owed, could still heal. Sometimes she'd sit beside me in the cell long after the trays were cleared and hum a tune I didn't recognize. I'd rest my head on her shoulder, just for a while. There was nothing romantic about it, only warmth, only survival, only two women stitching themselves back together in the dark. And when I asked her once what she thought we were witches, slave survivors, she answered with a whisper, daughters of wrath, quiet as ash, bright as coals. And I believed her. Because in a world where power was stolen through violence, she had taught me how to steal it back, one fake tear, one lowered eye, one well-placed silence at a time. They didn't call it a brothel. No, that would have been too honest. They called it La Maison de Lueur, the House of Glow, a place where men claim they came for conversation, for music, for the feminine arts. But everyone knew what the satin beds were for, what the velvet curtains were hiding, and everyone pretended otherwise. I was sold to them like fine china, cleaned, wrapped, and priced. The woman who bought me was called Madame Laz, a vision in lilac silk with fingers weighed down by jewels and eyes that never blinked. She smelled like violets and old secrets. Her voice was syrup sweet and slow like poison that took its time. You'll thank me, little one, she said, brushing a curl from my cheek. Here you won't bleed for scraps. You'll dine beside kings. She meant it. Here everything was wrapped in illusion. The girls wore lace corsets tight enough to bruise faces painted with innocence lips, like cherries dipped in silence. The floors gleamed like marble. The air was thick with jasmine. And the walls, they never echoed. Not screams, not sobs, not secrets. They trained us in everything except truth. How to walk like you were being watched. How to speak like every word cost a coin. How to smile just shy of seduction. They called it refinement, but it was just packaging. Behind the silk, we were all the same girls made useful by what men wanted to imagine we were. But there was one ritual that stripped even the illusion, the auctions. They happened monthly, and only the wealthiest were invited. A dozen girls dressed in white would line up, hair braided like lambs, and men would bide in virginity. Not real virginity. That was long gone for most. What they paid for was the performance. They'd inspect hen's teeth posture, ask about lineage. They wanted tragedy in our stories, orphans, abandoned daughters, girls rescued from burning churches. The more pure the tale, the higher the price. And the girls, they learned to cry on cue, to tremble just right, to flinch but not too much.
One night, a girl named Clarine told me how Madame Lise had taught her to use a sponge soaked in goat's blood to simulate first bloom. She whispered it while curling my hair like a tip between friends.
No one wants the truth, she smiled. They want a story they can violate without guilt. I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because I understood something then. If this game ran on fiction, I could be a better storyteller than all of them. So, I became Aveline the Graceful, the one who lost her mother to fever and was raised by nuns who sang at dawn, the girl who prayed, who sang, who wept with beauty too fragile to last. I spoke little, smiled faintly, and watched everything. One man offered 10 gold pieces just to kiss my hand. Another begged to braid my hair for an hour in silence. They thought they were taming me, but I was naming them one by one. The drunk count with the dead wife, the merchant with 5 daughters he never fed, the bishop who liked to hear confessions with his hand under the table. I kept a list, not for revenge, not yet, but for leverage, because in this house information was more valuable than flesh. Madame Lise taught us that, not with words, but with her ledger locked in a red box beneath her bed. I saw it once when she was too drunk to notice me cleaning. It was filled with names, dates, preferences, debts. Every man who stepped through her door owed her something. It was a coin, other times she She wasn't just a madam, she was a broker of secrets, and I was her best listener. I fed her whispers, and in return she protected me from the buyers too rough, from the nights too long. She called me her little shadow. But I knew the truth. Even shadows disappear when the light changes, so I made myself more than a shadow. I became the girl they all remembered, the one who never raised her voice but made them feel like they were sinning in silence, the one who never said yes but never had to say no, the one who smiled like a saint and moved like a dream and vanished before dawn. And they paid more for me than they ever did for blood. It started with a knock on the door at an ungodly hour. 3 taps quick, trembling like someone too scared to ask for help out loud. When I opened it, she stood there, barely 13 if that, eyes like wet stones, knees bleeding, holding her dress like it was the only thing keeping her together. They said I have to bleed, she whispered, or they'll know him not clean. Her name was Eliane, sold to the same house I had been. Not for pleasure yet, but trained, polished, prepared like meat waiting for its marinade. That night was to be her first, showing her proof of purity. That's what they called it, proof, as if pain was a certificate. As if a body's silence could be measured by a stain on a sheet. I didn't ask if it was true. It didn't matter, because she believed that if she didn't bleed, she'd be punished, or worse, discarded like spoiled goods. Some girls were. I'd seen it. Madame Lise would smile and say, "A lady without mystery is like a letter already read." And buyers. They wanted unopened envelopes, even if they had to seal them shut themselves. I took her inside and shut the door. And I remembered Clarine's trick, the sponge soaked in goat's blood, the fake hymen sold by midwives with no names. The beet juice, the pig bladders, the whispers passed from girl to girl like spells. But I also remembered something deeper. The look in a girl's eyes when she thought she had no value unless she hurt. I found the herbs, the cloth, the small needle prick tricks. I held her hand the whole time. And the next morning, the sheet bore a mark. It wasn't hers, it was mine. And no one asked questions. The buyer left satisfied. Madame Lise raised her glass, and Eliane. She looked at me like I'd given her something holy. But I hadn't. I'd only given her time. That was the beginning. After that night, the girls came in secret new ones, terrified, uncertain. They'd whisper, "Is it true? Can you help me too?" And I would. I stitched false tears in silk, mixed herbs to mimic the flush of pain, created small pouches with red wine and crushed berries sealed with wax, taught them how to tremble, how to cry at the right moment, how to even silence look like shame. We called it the ceremony, a mockery, yes, but a shield. Because in a world where blood meant worth, we learned to paint it ourselves. And soon I wasn't alone. Clarine joined me, then 2 others, then 6, each with their own trick, their own story, their own scar that no longer needed to be opened. We shared everything except our real pain, because real pain had no audience here, only the performance did. One night a man returned furious. His bride hadn't bled enough. He claimed deceit, demanded repayment. Madame Lise, calm as ever, said only, "Perhaps your sword wasn't sharp enough." The girls laughed quietly that night, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only rebellion left when your truth isn't allowed in the room. The system grew. Word spread. Even girls from other houses sent secret notes. Midwives, old crones, women once shamed into silence began to offer tools, warnings, prayers wrapped in cloth. We were no longer alone in the lie, and that made it powerful. But every spell has a cost. One girl was caught, Magda, who forgot to hide the sponge. The man beat her bloody, then bragged about it. They said she was impure, but I knew she was only unlucky. That night I etched his name into the underseat of my bed frame. Not for revenge, not yet. But because every name matters when you live among ghosts. Some call what we did a deception, but I say, it's only a lie if the truth was ever welcome. And in that house, truth was the enemy. Blood was the currency, and we learned to counterfeit survival. That's the part they never tell you in their stories of knights and maidens. That sometimes the bravest thing a girl can do is not to bleed. The girl's name was Surette. She was 17 or maybe 19. It was hard to tell anymore. Her back was always hunched from scrubbing floors, her hands always red from lye, and now her belly-rounded undeniable marked her as doomed. She hadn't told anyone, but she didn't need to. The house noticed before she could form the words. A maid with a growing belly wasn't a mother-to-be. She was a problem. One afternoon, Madame Lise had her summoned, not scolded, not warned, just told to wait in the courtyard until nightfall. She obeyed, thinking perhaps she'd be moved to the laundry wing or sent to a convent like some before her. Instead, 2 guards came at dusk. No words, no explanation, only the forest and a shovel. They left her in the thicket, where the wolves didn't come until late, but the cold came early, and she was told not to return. That was all. Not even a scream when they pushed her into the mud. Just a shuffle, a door closing behind her, and the world continuing as if she had never existed. But I saw. I watched from the top floor through a cracked shutter. I knew what would happen next. So that night after the house fell silent, I crept into the woods with a lantern and a knife. I wasn't sure why I brought the knife. Maybe because I didn't want to return empty-handed. I found her curled beside a tree stump, eyes wide but no longer seeing. One hand on her stomach, still, cold, alone. And beside her, no blood, no struggle, just a disappearance. As if the world had politely erased her. I covered her with leaves first, then with earth. Then I carved a name into a stone with the knife I brought. Not hers, his. The name of the man who did this. He was a steward, old, always watching the girls too closely, always speaking of piety with a wine-stained mouth. Surette never said it aloud, but her eyes did. I pressed the stone into the ground and whispered, 1, because it had begun. From that day on, I kept a journal, hidden beneath a loose stone in the chimney of the eastern wall. I called it the Red Book. Every time a girl disappeared, I wrote her name. Every time a belly grew and was punished, I wrote the name of the man we suspected. When no name was known, I left a blank space. But I always drew a womb beside it, sometimes cracked, sometimes bleeding, always empty. Because in this world, a woman's womb was not for children. It was for control, for labor, for punishment. And if it dared carry something unprofitable, it became a sin. The lies were never subtle. They told us pregnancy made us weak, impure, disposable. But they never said a word about the men who caused it. Not one word about the late-night visits. Not one word about the bribes, the threats, the accidents. Only shame for the ones who bled too late. One night I heard whispers outside my door. 2 girls, no more than 15, speaking in fragments. Serete. The one they buried, no. They say she ran away. They always say that. That was how I knew her story hadn't vanished. And that was enough. Because stories are seeds, and seeds grow roots. The Red Book grew heavier, not in weight, but in burden. I filled its pages with initials, then with full names. I began adding the method starvation, exile, accidents. Each page became an indictment. One by one, I wrote the stories no one wanted remembered. Because in this house of silks and lace and velvet sheets, nothing was softer than a woman's womb, and nothing more easily thrown away. But I remembered. I remembered every girl who rubbed her belly with fear. Everyone who looked at bread like it was hope. I remembered Soretti's face, and I swore no one else would be forgotten. Not while I still had ink. Not while I still had breath. Because maybe one day someone would open the book and read, and maybe then the wombs would no longer be empty graves. It was tucked behind the stone base of a broken statue, a crumbling book bound in cracked leather, its edges brittle from time and damp. I hadn't been looking for it. I had been scrubbing the altar in the old chapel, a place no one visited except for appearances when the candle I held flickered low. I knelt to retrieve a fallen cloth, and my fingers brushed something dry and foreign beneath the virgin's skirt. It was the journal. No title, no lock, just a name etched faintly on the inside cover. Isabeau. I turned the first page. The ink bled and trembled. The handwriting curled with elegance and desperation. They said I smiled when it happened, so I must have wanted it. My fingers froze. I had heard that phrase before. Whispers around dead girls. Justifications that traveled like perfume among men. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She came back to work the next morning, therefore willing. But this was from over 40 years ago. Isabeau had been a kitchen girl, then a laundress. Eventually, she was named in a ballad the Song of the Willing Maid. A myth, a warning, a lesson for other girls, don't be like her. Except none of the ballads told the story she wrote.
He brought me sugar candies, the ones we only saw on feast days. He said I owed him something sweet in return.
When I wept, he said I was confused. When I bled, he said I was ungrateful. When I stayed silent, they said I agreed. Page after page, she unfolded the same tale I had lived. The gifts, the threats, the shame, and then silence. The turning of stories. She had been turned into a symbol of temptation. A willing girl who enticed a nobleman and paid the price. But her words told the truth. She was a girl who said no and was punished for it by being remembered as if she had said yes. I closed the book, but I couldn't forget her. I carried it back in the folds of my skirt beneath a tray of half-washed linens. I didn't want anyone to see it. Not because I feared exposure, but because I wasn't ready to share her yet. Not until I could finish her story. So I began transcribing it, word for word, into my red book. And as I did, something began to shift inside me. For months I had written stories of others, Sarette, the child bride who never grew tall, the mute girl who miscarried in the snow. But now I understood something deeper. This wasn't new. We weren't the first. And we would not be the last. Because every generation of women had their Isabel. Someone whose body was used, whose voice was bent into legend, whose pain was powdered and dressed up as romance. They'd turn her into a tale that men sang with wine. Not because they wanted to remember her, but because they wanted to rewrite her. Even in my own time, I'd heard her name, Isabeau the Sweet, the maid who opened the door. They sang of her laughter, of her choice.
But they never sang of the bruise under her arm, of the dried blood in her undergarments, of the silence after.
I opened a fresh page in my red book, and I wrote, Isabeau, not willing. I underlined it 3 times, because this was the part no one had recorded, not the songs, not the sermons. But I would make it known that we did not ask for this. We were not temptresses or sirens or silly girls chasing noblemen. We were corralled, cornered, silenced. And when we did scream, they called it seduction. Isabeau's journal became my anchor, proof that even in the past the cycle had turned in the same shape, proof that they had always called us willing, because it was easier than calling their own kind rapists. I read the last line of her journal again. If no one believes me now, perhaps they will believe the girl who finds this. And I whispered into the dark, they will, because I would carry her name forward. Not as a myth, not as a cautionary tale, but as a witness. Her body may have been buried, her voice twisted into song, but now she would rise again. And the lie they wrapped around her, around all of us, would burn. The first time I did it, I thought I might vomit. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from the effort it took to smile. The man was old, his hands dry and spotted like bread crust. He had bought me for the night a favor from one lord to another. They called it polite company. He called it his reward. But I called it an audition. I poured his wine with my head tilted. I let my eyes linger too long. I laughed when he said something about training me gently. I took his hand and placed it on my bare collarbone just enough to make him believe he was in control. And then I leaned close, whispered, "You remind me of my father. His hand froze. His eyes narrowed not from suspicion, but from curiosity. I leaned back and giggled, then waited. That night, nothing happened, but 2 weeks later, he was arrested for moral corruption of his own daughter. I didn't need to lie. I only needed to leave breadcrumbs. The girl in question existed. She had whispered it to me long ago in the laundry room, between tears and torn underthings. All I did was give her a script, and she followed it. From that day on, I knew my silence had never been weakness. It had simply been waiting. Waiting for the moment it could become a scream disguised as seduction, a scream delivered in the voice men trusted most their own. I became an expert at it. It'd pretend to be shy, or damaged, or willing, or angry, whichever mask their hunger most desired. Then I'd place a rumor in the right ear, drop a detail only a guilty man would recognize, write a note in a trembling hand, or whisper a name during prayer. Soon things began to unravel. A merchant was caught flogging his niece. A stable master was found dead with a torn page of scripture in his mouth. A bishop's ring was discovered in a child's cot. None of it was directly from me, and yet all of it started with me. Because silence, I learned, could be carved into hooks, could be shaped into traps, and nothing ensnared faster than a man desperate to protect his own secrets, especially when he thought he was being pursued by a girl who wanted him. Sometimes I wrote letters. Sometimes I simply asked questions. Sometimes I cried, but only in places where the walls had ears. The thing they never understood was this. I didn't want revenge. I wanted infection. I wanted their kind to start looking at each other with suspicion, to wonder which girl had finally spoken, to choke on the fear that their next conquest might come with teeth. And it worked. The brothel where I once served now lit fewer candles. The women whispered less but moved more freely. Even the guards who once grabbed me by the hips now offered fake smiles and called me madame. One even asked for advice. Advice on how to avoid the traps. I told him, "Don't touch what doesn't ask to be touched." He laughed. 2 weeks later, his hand was found nailed to the chapel door. I didn't do it, but I knew who did.
Because I had given her sugar candy and taught her to smile.
They always assumed that because we didn't speak, we forgot. That silence meant obedience. That our closed mouths were locked vaults, not loaded crossbows. But now, the vaults are opening, and the crossbows are firing. We don't scream like they expect. We scream with records, with shadows, with rumors they can't trace, with stories they can't erase. We scream in the same frequency they used to whisper in. And that, my friend, is what finally makes them afraid. It was not the chains I feared, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a question no one dares to answer. The quiet after a door shuts and you realize you're not coming back the same. That night I did not run, I walked, slow, deliberate, through the servant passages, past the hidden stairwells, the brothel disguised as a sewing hall, the priest's hidden crawl space. Each step I carried more than my own breath. I carried their secrets, wrapped tightly in linen and oilskin, a bundle no bigger than a newborn, but heavier than any child should be. Inside, dozens of pages, smuggled letters, names, dates, what they paid for, who they broke, some written by me, most not. The women had trusted me, whispered in darkness, handed me tokens of memory,
Blood-stained scraps, prayer ribbons, diary corners. Confessions no one ever heard until I wrote them down.
We called it the book, not because it was complete, but because it was the only thing that gave us shape. Shape to the violence, shape to the shame, shape to the rage that had nowhere to go except into a pen. I didn't plan to be the one to carry it, but everyone else was gone. Mira branded and vanished. Sister Elaine transferred to a cloister no one could name. Isolde, last seen leaving with a man in fur, never returned. Even the younger girls had learned to keep their eyes down and their memories buried. I remembered for all of them, and that made me dangerous. So I escaped, not through fire or fight, but by invitation.
One of the nobles, bored of his current plaything, asked for a quiet one. I made sure my name reached his steward. I smiled when they took me from the cellar, bathed in rose water, braided my hair.
And when they handed me to him, I bowed. He asked no questions. He liked it that way. The ride was long, the manor smaller than expected, but I found the window I needed, found the dog I could feed scraps to, found the guard who couldn't resist flattery. And then one night I left, with nothing but boots too big and the book tied tight beneath my breasts. I walked through frost and silence, avoided roads, slept in barns, shared crusts with widows, sang lullabies to avoid suspicion. I never stayed more than a night, not because I feared being caught, but because I knew what I carried. In every page, every ink blot and tear mark was proof. Proof of a system, not a single villain, but a world built on selling our bodies, our silence, and then our disappearance. And that world wasn't just one castle or one lord. It was everywhere. Even the women I met, some looked at me with sympathy, others with suspicion. Not all wanted the book to exist. Some had made peace with forgetting. Others had learned to survive by believing they had never been touched. But I couldn't uncarry what I knew. I found an abbey, not famous, not rich, but with a scribe who had crooked fingers and kind eyes. I told him I had a family ledger. He agreed to help me copy it for coin. He didn't ask why the ink smelled like ash, why some names were scratched out, others circled in blood. He didn't ask why my hands shook. I paid him in stories, told him tales of girls born in pig pens who became baronesses, of ghosts that only appeared to the guilty, of women who kissed each other under the chapel bell and lived. He liked those stories, said they sounded like justice. I left the abbey after 3 days, 2 copies of the book in hand. One I hid under a floorboard in a forest church. The other I took further, toward the coast. They say if you throw a message into the sea, it will find the one who needs it. I didn't throw mine. I buried it in a sealed chest, beneath a tree marked with a braid of horsehair and rosemary, a signal only those who had suffered would recognize. I don't know if anyone ever found it, but I do know this: I never returned, and I never stopped writing, because sometimes the last room you escape is the one inside your own chest, where shame once lived, and now only memory remains. Memory. And the promise that someone else one day will dig where I buried the truth. There are stories that begin with glory. Mine did not. Mine began with silence, shame, and a bruised girl holding ink-stained parchment and shaking hands. But this is not the beginning. This is the legacy. I never saw my name etched into stone. No stained glass bore my face. No bard sang my tale in candlelit halls. Yet somewhere in the quiet far from the chambers and cellars where my skin had once been a currency, I wrote, not to be remembered, but so that others would not be erased. My name is Aveline, but the pages I left behind carry no signature. They don't need one. Each line speaks the names of women who were only ever whispered. Each word is a resurrection. We were the bent, the broken, the bartered, but we wrote. In the blood we hid, in the breath we still had, in the defiance of still being here. I called it the Manual of the Touched, not a book of revenge, not a guide for resistance, but a ledger of truth carved by hands that were once bound. It held no plot, only fragments, a list of names. A girl who gave birth in the snow, a nun who stitched warnings into the hems of dresses, a child who forgot her own name but remembered the man's scent. It was not beautiful, but it was real. I buried the first copy beneath a tree older than memory. I burned the second not in despair, but as offering. Let the smoke carry those names to a god who never listened before. The third I gave to a girl who didn't flinch when I said priest. Who knew the weight of secrets, though her mouth had never spoken one? She read the book for 3 days, never asked me why I wrote it, only how long it took. Too long, I said. Then she asked if she could copy it. I watched her fingers strong and swift ink her own version, but not identical. She changed the names, not to hide them, but to speak new ones, hers, and others like her. I had not expected that, but it was then I understood stories are not monuments, they are seeds. You bury one in desperation, and someone else grows it in fire. And when they asked her years later who had taught her to remember, she said, a woman who walked out of a locked room with a book and no name. That was enough to begin again. I do not know what world now holds her, but I know she will write her own truths, and someone else will follow. This was never about my survival. It was about creating a path for voices that were never meant to echo. In a world that measured our worth by silence, writing was rebellion, and remembering was magic. They called us liars. They called us seducers. They called us whores. But never once did they ask why we had to lie to live. Let them write their histories of kings and saints. We, the women who bled, birthed, and bore the weight of men's desires, we have begun writing our own. And if someday a girl finds this book in the dark, clutches it to her chest with trembling hands, and reads not for entertainment, but for evidence that she is not alone, then everything I suffered was not in vain. My body was not my sin, their touch was. And this story, it was never theirs to write.